Where do I sit? Here, you there?
Yeah,
No.
let's do this. Yeah.
We have to because I need my things.
Yes, I agree. That's for all of you. Well, Jane, thank you. But you're on such a roll, and there's so many things that I know are so rich in your story. I don't want to talk about the global issues just yet. I want to stay on the themes that you put forward. But first, I wanted to thank Robert Smith for his initiative in bringing us together. Thank you.
Jonathan, you mean bringing us together here today?
Yes,
Not at the beginning.
No, right. It's not that big a deal. But he is trying to bring some of the richest, most influential people in the world together with substantive issues. Because he was in a business just bringing capital and businesses together, and then after he met Jane, it was transformative in his life, and he decided to try and bring these important issues that bring meaning to our lives to people who were only looking in business. And because business is certainly not an end in itself. It's a means to becoming free enough to be a moral agent to make a difference. And Robert, thank you for saying yes to what you heard from Jane. And I believe there'll be many people in the audience today for whom Jane will be an example in the way she's been an example to me of what one person can do with the gifts and skills that they have and say, I will make a difference for the good of all. So, you know, you talked a little bit about your teachers, Dr. Rusty.
Dr. Rusty will do.
Dr. Leakey.
I know there's somebody in this room called Rusty. I just met him. But mine was a dog.
Yeah, Dr. Rusty. And Dr. Graybeard. And there's one story of Dr. Graybeard that you told me when Jane spoke in front of the American Bar Association, we had a dialogue. And I can tell you that that had such a profound effect on, I mean, just imagine like being in a room with about 1,000 lawyers. Not quite as, the vibes are a little different. But Jane really touched the people because this is a story that says so much. It is such an iconic story. It's a breakthrough story, I think, in a way, in human pioneering. And I wondered if you could tell that story of David Graybeard and you alone in the forest.
Yes, well, it was when I first began to be allowed to follow David when he moved off, and chimps often travel alone. And I thought I'd lost him going through a tangle of vegetation, and then I came through and he was sitting looking back as though waiting for me. And okay, so you be David Graybeard now.
Gladly.
And I see a ripe palm nut on the ground, so I pick it up and I hold it out to him. No, you do what I tell you. So I hold it out to him on the palm of my hand, and you at the back can't see unless we do it a little unnaturally. And he turned his face away. So I put my hand a little closer. He turned and looked directly into my eyes. He reached out, took and dropped the nut, and then very gently held my hand, which is how chimpanzees reassure each other. So in that one moment, we communicated in a way which must have been common to those ape-like, human-like ancestors, and we understood each other perfectly. It was a very seminal moment for me.
So that moment, the capacity of inner mutual awareness was communicated. And he rejected the object of sharing, but accepted the sharing.
Yeah, it was bad or something, I don't know.
So this was presented to 1,000 lawyers, at which point I said, Jane is, as it were, a witness who has testified as to a fact. You can either accept the fact that she's a credible witness. I was a Philadelphia lawyer for 22 years, so forgive me. Forgive me. You can either accept the fact or reject it. If you reject it, so be it. You go on as usual. If you accept it, then we need to make some changes, because in our legal system and in our entire government and the way we do business, we treat chimpanzees and all other species as mere property, the same as a rock or a stone, a piece of gold, a piece of silver, a piece of dirt. And it's clear from this testimony that other species have extraordinary, immeasurable, beautiful value. They're a mystery. I mean, a mystery, the more you study and read Jane's books, the more you realize that we live in a community of living species that are not just our property. There's something precious about it. And I was thinking that we're destroying species now at least 1,000 times the evolutionary base rate. Why are we doing that? What's going on, Jane?
I think what's happened is that we've got caught up in a materialistic, greedy way of thinking. Without any question, we are the most intellectual species to ever walk the planet. The big difference, chimps are very smart, elephants, dolphins, all sorts of beings. But we've sent people to the moon. We've got a robot crawling around Mars. We've been learning about the rings around Saturn. I mean, it's amazing, our human intellect. Look at the buildings, look at the works of art, look at Shakespeare. And so how is it that this most intellectual creature is destroying its only planet? And I think there's been a disconnect between this clever brain and love and compassion, the human heart. And I think we're making decisions without any regard to future generations. It's all about me now. What's this going to do to help me now, me and my family now? The next shareholder meeting, my next political campaign. And so somehow we need to reconnect head and heart, I believe, to achieve our true human potential.
There's an Eskimo elder.
Uncle.
Yes, uncle. I was recently with him in The Hague at the Peace Palace last week, where the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court sits, and he was talking about the extraordinary melting of what was 3 miles deep of ice and the melting. And I remember at the Peace Summit at the United Nations at the Millennium, he spoke, and his words resonate right there. And I wondered if you could remind us what was the point that he made.
Well, the point that he made was, you know, we're causing the ice to melt through climate change. But what will it take to melt the ice in the human heart?
I think that's the question of our moment and our time. It's not just the rejection of science, that we put science at risk. We have people denying the science on the climate. But it seems that the quest for the love of power has changed us from questing for the power of love, which might very well be what makes us human at the end of the day. I'm not sure what makes us human, but I do know my political mentor, Senator Alan Cranston, used to say that the planet Earth might be the only place in the universe where love can exist, and therefore we should save it from annihilation, just as simple as that. Amazing. You know, he didn't put it in terms of survival, he put it in terms of love. But I wonder, Jane, since you've described how chimpanzees seem to have something like love, right?
Oh, well, watch a mother and her family. And, you know, this love, and we know now so much on YouTube about relations between animal and human. They're really, if you pull them together, which I would love to do, it's quite extraordinary. But, you know, one story is about a young man who's employed to look after 4 chimpanzees who'd been in medical research, brutally treated, and they were now free out on the island. 3 females, 1 male. He was known as Old Man. And a baby was born, his child. He loved that child. He carried it around, he shared his food, he ran to protect it from real or imagined danger. And Mark, the young man, managed to get a relationship with Old Man through patience and handing him bananas.
Mark is the human being.
Mark is the human being.
And the old man is a chimp.
Old Man is the chimp. And so he was able to groom Old Man and tickle him in his ticklish neck so that Old Man laughed. And it was fine. And then one day he slipped on the muddy island, Mark did, and fell flat on his face. And unfortunately, the infant was nearby, and he startled the infant, who screamed. The mother immediately rushed to rescue her child and bit deep into his neck. The other two females ran to support their friend. One bit his thigh, and the other bit his wrist. And he's looking up, wondering how on earth he's going to get away from this attack. And now he sees old man thundering across the island, bristling hair, lips bunched in a furious scowl. Oh, he thinks he's coming to protect his infant. He thinks I've hurt his infant, and he prepared to die. But what happened? Old man physically pulled those three females away and kept them away while Mark dragged himself to the boat and safety. And I went to visit Mark when he came out of hospital, and he said, no question, old man saved my life. And the reason I love that story is because if an animal who's been cruelly treated by us can nevertheless help a human friend in time of need, then surely we, with our greater capacity for understanding, can help the animals and other human beings in their time of need.
That story shows also that here was a elderly chimp who'd never interacted in that way, who was not just operating out of what we would call instinct, that he had made a choice to reject the actions of his own species in order to protect the life of another species, something that I think humans now have a responsibility to do. So here's an instance. You've talked about how chimps they make tools. You talked about discovering. You were one of the people that first discovered chimps as tool making. Yes, you were the person. This is Philly. This is like a Quaker town. You're supposed to. So that was a very inside Philly joke, Yes, Jane was the first person who did that. Jane was the person who discovered Lucy. And Jane is the person who's going to help us open our hearts today. We should stand up for virtue. I mean, everyone else has come out of the closet. People who just care deeply about loving kindness and compassion, and who care deeply about future generations, we've got to stand up too. We have to really stand up and be proud of it. And Jane has a right to be proud of the discoveries that you've made.
I was just lucky to be there to make them.
Yeah, but you've owned it. But you've owned it and shared it. You've owned it and shared it with us.
Of course.
And at this point, I just want to recognize some of the people that I see in the audience who've done things like that. There's a colonel, a military figure in the audience, who was one of the people in charge of U.S. military troops in Bosnia. And I have spoken to people from Sarajevo, in fact, the Grand Mufti of Sarajevo, who told me how grateful they were because of what Colonel Ken Breyer did, which was what Jane did in Africa, which was go to the villages and ask people, how can we help you? How can we be of service to you? And that worked, and that's heroic in my opinion. Thank you, Colonel Breyer. And we also have in our audience a senior Indian diplomat who helped organize the Day of Nonviolence at the United Nations to honor Mahatma Gandhi, who stood up for these values, and who also helped create International Yoga Day. This is Prakash Gupta, who's India's ambassador to Indonesia, deputy. And Audrey Kitagawa, who worked at the United Nations to help heal child soldiers. She went into the camps of children who had been brutally abused to help create programs to save them. These are people amongst us. And I know what has motivated each of these people has been love. But Jane tells us chimpanzees have love. Chimpanzees make tools. What makes us different? What is the difference between humans and chimps?
Well, I think, one difference is at some point in our evolution, we developed this way of communicating with words. So although chimpanzees and many other animals have very complex communication gestures and postures and ways of interacting with each other, we can discuss problems. We can bring together people from different walks of life to discuss and try to solve problems. We can teach children about things that aren't present. So that's why it's so bizarre that we're destroying the planet. But you have been pointing out people in the audience. Now it's my turn. So there's somebody here in the front row, Bart Wiegand, I've known him for years, and stand up, Bart, because I'll tell you about him now. And I'm just going to stand up for a minute so you can see at the back. When I first met Bart, he was talking about he had a passion for doing something about landmines, destructive landmines. I think Jonathan has something to say about them too. But he kept going back. He was looking at all the technology, and he told me he kept thinking back to his pet rat he had as a child and how he would hide food all over, and always the rat found it. He wanted to train rats to detect landmines. And it took him a lot of time and work and the help of his brother to get a little bit of money. But the problem is the normal rat only lives 3 years. So yes, they could detect the smell of landmines. So he found the giant forest rat, or pouched or hamster rat, in Africa, and they can live 8 or 9 years. And I watched the training of these rats, and they're very light. They can't explode a landmine, but if they smell the landmine beneath the surface, they'll give a little scratch, and they get a little reward. And now they're being trained to detect the earliest signs of TB, and they're also, some of them are trained to detect the scent of ivory, some rhino horn, some pangolin scales, and so on. So Bart is standing up for the animal kingdom and the intelligence of the rat.
So I was just thinking, on the evolutionary scale, rats are doing a great deal to save human lives by getting rid of landmines. So I have a personal story, like you told personal stories. During the 1990s, there were a series of world summits. The most one you heard about probably was the World Summit on Women in Beijing, where Hillary Clinton said women's rights are human rights. There was a World Summit on the rights of children. In every country in the world but 2, Somalia and the United States, has signed the Covenant on the Rights of Children and ratified it on the rights of children. We haven't. There was a World Summit on human habitats, on cities. There was a World Summit on getting rid of poverty, the World Summit on social development, out of which has now come what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, that all the nations in the world have agreed to pursue: eliminating poverty, making childhood education universal, gender equity, protecting the climate, protecting the water. At least a quarter of the human population doesn't have decent water. But the place where that began was the World Summit on Human Development in Copenhagen in 1995. And it hit me that huge amounts of agriculture can't be used because of landmines. So I convened a press conference on the subject of getting rid of landmines. And I was running to get there because I was late. And while I was running to get there, in fact, these are the actual shoes that I was wearing. And there was a nail coming through the shoe. And the nail was sticking in my foot. And it was causing me, which to me was excruciating pain. And I was running, and I thought, well, I could stop and get rid of, do something about it. But no, I'll just grit through it, and I'll get there. And as I was getting there, I was so proud of myself that I just withstood the pain, and this was more important. I was just overwhelmed with pride. And I walked in, and I sat down, and to my right and to my left were 2 young men who had lost their legs to landmines.
And Jonathan, this looks like a little funny. It's a sock. It's the toe of a sock. And this was used by one of those, not your two, but Chris Moon. He lost one leg and one arm to a landmine, and he'd always wanted to run marathons. This is the sock that he put over his stump when he did the worst marathon in the world across the Sahara. So that's what this is. And the last one is this little bell. Not a very good bell, but it's made from metal from a diffused landmine in Cambodia or Mozambique. It might have been by one of your rats. Let's say it was, because the rats find the landmines and then they get diffused. So when the peace bell is rung at the UN every year on International Peace Day, I have my little bell and I ring it too.
Yes, Jane was just with the Secretary General of the UN 2 days ago, ringing the peace bell at the United Nations. I should highlight. But there is but as great work as you do, and as people do to get rid of landmines are planted by governments. Landmines are built with the permission of governments, and there is a treaty to eliminate landmines. And the United States, sadly, has not ratified that treaty. And so there are landmines still being produced, still being planted. Although the treaty has degraded them, they still are there. And similarly, I devote my life to the elimination of nuclear weapons, which could eliminate all of us. And if we take care of every problem but that one, it won't matter very much. So I'm the president of an organization started by Mikhail Gorbachev and Senator Alan Cranston to strengthen treaties and the rule of law to move us to degrade the value of these weapons and get rid of the 15,000 swords of megadeath hanging over our head. And I'm sitting here looking at one of the great, because that's done by diplomats, one of the great diplomats of America. We're talking about the science of Benjamin Franklin, but it was Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic efforts that helped win the Revolutionary War, that he convinced the French to come on our side. And it was his diplomatic insight when he met with the indigenous people, the people of the different nations, the 7 nations, that gave him the idea of federalism, of bringing together 13 separate states to form the United Nations in this city. And we don't talk much about all of those dimensions of Benjamin Franklin, the diplomat, the philosopher, the visionary, the multiple dimensions. But what I've seen is when people delve deeply into something, they see the integration of issues in the way Dr. Goodall pointed out how the impoverishment in Kenya, the impoverishment in Tanzania was causing the destruction of the forest, causing the destruction of the chimpanzees, and then coming back to the global. So I wondered...
Yeah, along with the greed of the Western world, started by colonialism in Europe, going into the poor countries and taking the natural resources. It's going on today with the big corporations. China is going all over Africa and Asia and Latin America, taking the natural resources for its own development. China's not doing any worse than what we did and what many of the big corporations do today. And yet it's the thing to point a finger at China. China's changing. But what do we do when we want to develop our country and we've run out of our own natural resources? We want to go and take them from elsewhere. And that's part of what's leading to the destruction of the environment around the world. And also our greed, because I say we have more than we need. And also, you know, I have my little farmyard here. This is Cow, that's her name. She's called Cow. Why do I carry Cow? Well, one of the things that's very, very key in climate change, global warming, is intensive animal farming. And people don't realize that. People have begun to understand the cruelty. People are beginning to understand the misuse of antibiotics because these poor creatures in the intensive farms have to be fed antibiotics regularly, not when they're sick, to keep them alive.
Wow.
And so the bacteria are building up resistance, and you can die from a scratched finger. And I heard the Surgeon General in Britain 2 years ago, he said, I hate to say this, but the era of the antibiotic may be coming to an end. Think what that will mean for us. And of course, in addition, there's this horrible impact on the environment. To feed these animals, cows, pigs, chickens, and so on, whole areas of environment are destroyed to grow the grain. Huge amounts of fossil fuel are used to take the grain to the animals to slaughter the meat to the table. Water wasted to turn vegetable into animal protein. And so in addition to that, and this is what I take, to show the kids, when you have a cow or a horse or a human, for that matter, food goes in one end, and what comes out the other is methane. Mm-hmm. And that is a very virulent greenhouse gas. These gases, carbon dioxide is the main one, and nitrous oxide, which blanket the surface of the globe, trapping the heat of the sun, leading to global warming, leading to climate change, and these hurricanes and floods and so forth, which are getting more frequent, leading to the melting of the ice, leading to the raised levels in the ocean, so that people have already had to leave island homes because at high tide they're flooded. So eating a little bit less meat or being a vegetarian actually is one of the things that we can do. People are always saying, what can we do? Mm-hmm. And all the little choices we make each day, little ones, turning off lights, thinking about what we buy, how do we treat people and animals. Cumulatively, as more and more people around the world make these decisions ethically, then we're moving towards the kind of world that we truly need if we want to leave something for our great-great-grandchildren.
One of the things that Franklin, like yourself, saw the relationship between developing human character and the larger political issues. He spoke a lot about the importance of the character of the people. And he used to keep a diary in which he would grade himself on compassion, love, patience, and his qualities. Each day he would give himself grades. He had a big problem with humility, though.
She's coming
But
to do audience questions.
I wanted you to tell us one of the things that Jane has done to build character in the next generation, to bring these insights into practice, to bring action into it, is Roots and Shoots. I think, tell people where it is, what does it do, how many children are in it, where is it going, how can we help?
Well, anybody can help who has a child or knows a child or is a child by starting a group. And I did mention it before. And I think one of the reasons why it's different from other youth groups is it's holistic. It's animals, people, environment. It's helping to break down the barriers that we build between people of different nations, different cultures, different religions, to help people understand that you can look at the DNA of our blood, we're all one family. If we bleed, it hurts. The pain is the same. If we find something funny, we laugh. Our laughter's the same. And we truly do need to break down these barriers of discrimination and racial hatred. And that's something which Roots and Shoots is all about as well. There's about 100,000 active groups of all these ages.
100,000 active groups.
And a group can be a whole school. I've seen a huge change in China in attitude towards animals and the environment. I never thought of it being anything to do with Roots and Shoots, which I began there in '94, I think it was. But people coming up saying to me, well, of course I care about animals. I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school.
Yes.
Of course I care about Roots and Shoots, environment. I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school. And so it's changing the world as we speak. And I need help in growing it faster, and we need to grow it here in Philadelphia. I'm sure he would love to help grow it.
So if anyone has any influence in any schools or the school system, please get in touch with the Jane Goodall Institute. because I've seen, I mean, the main part that I've seen from kids in Roots and Shoots is a sense of personal responsibility to bring the highest human qualities into action. So it's not just an academic endeavor, but it's a real way of learning, of actually getting your hands in the dirt, metaphorically and literally, so to speak. So it's transformative. Planting trees, cleaning
organic
rivers.
Vegetables, working in shelters. In fact, we have Susanna and Anna here from the Jane Goodall Institute.
Stand up, please.
There they are. Anna's with development. Susanna, for her sins, travels around with me. And her son, right now, who's been Roots and Shoots, is in Florida rescuing animals from the floods. So poor Susanna's ending up with all these extra dogs and cats. I don't know what's going to happen.
Dr. Jayantri is not one of the young students. Despite the fact that she looks so young, she's one of the world's most distinguished scholars in neuroscience, biology, and a variety of subjects, and she is one of the treasures of the Franklin Institute. And she has some sharp questions for us. Doctor.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to join this conversation. And actually, I'm here to ask all of your questions. So you'll see instructions on how to submit your questions to us to relay to Dr. Goodall and Mr. Granoff here. I wanted to segue first off of this idea of Roots and Shoots and all of the great work that your organization is doing, because we've had some questions about, how do we help inspire kids who live in cities, like here in Philadelphia? How do we help them make that connection to these issues of conservation and world peace that can sometimes seem very far away? Could you tell us some stories of other kids who have gotten involved?
Well, I find that, I do a lot of talking in schools, talking to children. I've written children's books. And you find in children, very young children, that they all are passionate about something. Some of them really care about being nice to people. They care about people. Some of them care about animals. They want to help animals. Some of them really want to clean up the streets of litter or clean a river or plant trees. And so if we can't take children from the inner city out into the country, then we try to bring the country into them. And that happens a lot in some of the museums. So I don't find, we started working and testing if Roots and Shoots would work in the inner city, in the Bronx, and in some of the really tough San Fernando Valley parts of Los Angeles. And there the kids, as soon as you talk to them, what we have to do is listen to their voices, listen to what they care about, and Roots and Shoots allows them to choose what they want to do. And that's absolutely key. So if you have a group of 30 kids, they don't all have to help animals, they don't all have to help people, they don't all have to help the environment, but they all have to listen to what the others are doing. And it's easy, it isn't difficult at all. So we work in rural Africa, we work in refugee camps, we have leaders who are ex-child soldiers in DRC. And I have to tell one, I must tell this story because it somehow ties in with a lot of what we've been talking about. It's in Democratic Republic of Congo, the first little Roots and Shoots group, 8 to 12-year-old. And there's always violence going on in eastern DRC. There's always militia. And so our coordinator of the group, the children came to him and said, we learned that hill over there used to be a sacred hill covered in trees, and now the trees are gone. We want to put them back. Well, they didn't realize quite how big the hill was, and he didn't want to damp their enthusiasm. So he managed to get some seedlings donated. But then he had to go to the resident militia, the colonel, and ask permission to go with the children. So you can imagine 15 little children carrying their little seedlings, and I suppose a little spade, trailing off to this hill. 4 soldiers with AK-47s. And they get to the hill, and it's very hot. And it's very hard ground. And after a bit, one little girl, she's 8, she begins to cry. And after about 10 minutes, one of the soldiers leans his gun on a tree and goes to help her. Within 20 minutes, all the soldiers are helping the children plant trees. And to me, this is really symbolic.
So it's really really about finding, what you're passionate about, and it doesn't matter what that thing is.
Doesn't matter what
Just
it is.
look for a way that you can make a difference.
Encourage them, listen to them, empower them.
So there are a lot of kids in the audience today, and one of them asked a question about chimpanzees, which is, how do you tell them apart?
Well, if you go into a strange country, you sometimes look at people and think, how on earth do I tell them all apart? Chimpanzees, once you get to know them, have the same differences in facial structure and body posture. They certainly have differences in behavior. So once you get to know them, it's easy.
You can almost think about the fact that
And some have gray beards and some don't.
And we share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees.
98.6% of our DNA is the same.
So.
And we breathe the same phytoplankton. That I was recently I was in Russia speaking to 5,000 of the elite youth of the country, and they had expected me to talk about international law and treaties, but I talked about the third lung, which is that 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton in the oceans, which is at risk because of the climate change and the imbalances of pH and acidic. Imagine a third lung in the room. We could each lose one of our lungs, but we can't lose that third lung. And the only way to protect that lung is by the nations of the world cooperating. So this isn't a choice, this is a necessity. And these students, these were Russian kids, and I said, do we share this lung? Do we share this lung with one another? Do we share it, I mentioned chimpanzees? Do we share this? And once you realize that you're breathing together, then there's a sense of physical intimacy. And this is a scientific reality. And this is not like some option. We can't sort of experiment with the health of the oceans.
No,
we
also
have to.
The forest, Jonathan.
Forest is
That's the other
28%
great
of our,
lung.
yeah.
Forests and
Forests are other lungs, and we simply cannot experiment with what would happen if we destroy this. And this requires nations and laws. This can't be done as a bunch of deals.
Right.
This requires laws, and that requires moving from the very point of the individual to the global.
So that's a great segue into another question from the audience that we have, which is that, we talk a lot at the Franklin Institute about the fact that science isn't just about facts. It's about applications, it's about values. And you talked a little bit earlier about how, critical to your efforts at conservation was also thinking about the people involved. So if we expand that to a global scale, as you're suggesting here, how do you balance, the capitalist systems that we have that people look to provide economic opportunity with the need for conservation and thinking about this shared biology that we need to preserve?
Well, it's difficult. And the trouble is that if we can't solve that problem, then what we're in now, the sixth great extinction, and as species disappear, whole ecosystems can collapse. If we don't solve this problem, that's the end of us on the planet. The planet will restore itself somehow or other, but we will disappear, or at least most of us will. So we have to try and solve it. We have to find ways of living in harmony. And that's what Roots and Shoots is all about. We have to learn to do with less. We have to alleviate poverty so that they, in turn, can think about the environment. And this is where our human brain can play a great part. You see cities going up, you see green walls, you see solar and wind energy. There's all sorts of ways. But we also have to think about growing human populations. And this isn't, I'm not trying to say we should do this, but if you think about people trying to grow enough food to feed the nation, we don't want starving people. But then in the same breath you hear, well, in so many years, there's going to be twice as many human beings on the planet. Therefore, we've got to grow twice as much food. So it's a continual thing. Okay, we can have more and more people because we'll find ways of growing more and more food. At some point, we have to say the planet cannot survive this. The planet cannot replenish itself. We cannot continue to grow more and more and more food if the population continues to grow and grow and grow. So we've got to solve it.
There are ideas that matter. Modern capitalism is only about 400 years old. The limited liability corporation was created in Holland, you know, in the 17th century, and it was created with a model of infinite growth. But the natural world is more like a circle. There's no garbage in nature. Things replenish, rejuvenate, recycle. But our model is an infinitely growing economy in a closed system that is not infinite. So when modern capitalism was created, when our model of economics was created, we didn't know the truth, the scientific fact that nature is not infinite. We now know this. We now know that we have to breathe the same phytoplankton. We now know we have to share the rainforest. We now know that we're part of this mysterious web of life with other creatures. We didn't know that then. We know this now. So we need to change, and we need to have a conversation of the best minds, the best economists, the best lawyers, the best scientists. We can't be in denial about these things. There's no simple answers. But we now know one really important point that Jane made at the very beginning. It has to begin with the compassionate heart, not the greedy heart. It has to begin with the motive that's pure and good. And then the intellect will follow. There are solutions. That's another dialogue.
Well, there aren't solutions if we continue to grow our population. I mean, we've got to realize,
Yes.
you know, we have to realize that. So we need a circular economy. We need to reuse. Instead of throwing stuff away into landfills, and it's beginning to happen.
Yes.
Roots and Shoots are really good at that. We have competitions as to, you know, take trash and turn it into something useful. We have amazing ideas.
Yes.
Yes.
And so how do we shift this conversation then from thinking about it as a competition between, you know, conservation and opportunity to thinking about how does helping animals help ourselves as well? That we're all in this together.
And that's what Roots and Shoots is all about. You know, and people say to me, well, what is your dream? And I always think, if you dream to reach the stars, you might reach the moon. If you want to reach the moon, you might reach the top of Everest. So I like to aim for the stars. Never mind whether I'll get there or not. I'll get higher if I reach for the stars than if I reach for the moon or if I reach for Everest. So my goal won't happen in my lifetime, but I hopefully Roots and Shoots is something that'll last, is a critical mass of young people sharing a philosophy, wanting to go into this circular economy, wanting to live in harmony with each other, understanding that racial discrimination is based on something that isn't real. That's the dream. And we can work together to make that dream become a reality.
So we've got a number of kids and teachers in the audience who are asking how to get involved in Roots and Shoots. So can you refer them to a website or an organization that can help them?
You just look up www.rootsandshoots.org. It's very easy, and then you'll find out
Write
exactly.
that one down. We'll tweet it out.
Rootsandshoots.org. And by the way, why is it called Roots and Shoots? I happen to love trees. And so my favorite tree is a 2,000-year-old British oak. And it started as an acorn. And when it began to grow, that great old tree, I could have picked it up and there'd be little roots and a little shoot, and it would have seemed so insignificant. But there's a magic. It's the life force so powerful that those little roots to reach the water can work through rocks and eventually push them aside. And that little shoot to reach the sunlight can work through cracks in a brick wall and eventually knock it down. So we see that if we think of the rocks and the walls as all the problems we humans have inflicted on this planet, environmental and social, then it's hope. Hundreds and thousands of young people around the world can break through and make this a better world for all living things. And so all of you children here, Can you all stand up and wave your hands if you want to get involved in Roots and Shoots? Wherever you are. That's great, and I love you all.
So Jane, I have one last question before we end for the day, which is that I've noticed you haven't told us a story about one last stuffed animal on the table.
This is Mr. H, and some of you have seen him. Almost every film you see of Dr. Jane, I'm carrying Mr. H. He was given to me 25 years ago by a man called Gary Horn, who was in the US Marines, who went blind when he was 21.
Jane,
You're muffling the mic.
Oh, and he went blind when he was 21. And when he's learning to live in this new dark world, for some strange reason decided he wanted to be a magician. Everybody said, but Gary, you can't be a magician if you're blind. He said, well, I can try. And he's so good. If he was here, you wouldn't know he was blind. He sets his props out ahead of time. He works with kids. And at the end of his show, he'll tell them he's blind. And he'll say, something might happen in your life. You never know. But if it does, don't give up. There's always a way forward. He does cross-country skiing. He does scuba diving. He does skydiving. And he has just taught himself, this is true, he's taught himself to paint. And on Amazon, you can find this book. It's only on Amazon. It's called Blind Artist by Gary Horn, H-A-U-N. And there's a picture in it of this. He thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee, and I made him hold a tail. And he said, never mind, take him where you go, and you're with me in the spirit. So he's been with me to 63 countries. And in this book, you can't see it from here, but there's a portrait of Mr. H. He's never seen Mr. H. This is just done from feeling. And it's the indomitable human spirit. You know, so my reasons for hope are the energy and commitment of young people and how they're changing the world. It's the human brain with its ability to create innovative technology, but also in organizing our own lives. It's the resilience of nature, so that those bare hills around Gombe are now covered in trees, and animal species on the brink of extinction are being given another chance. It's social media that can bring people from all around the world together on a single issue so that our voices get louder and louder, and we support each other, and in the end we will be heard. And finally, this indomitable human spirit. And there are icons. I've got a little piece of limestone from Robben Island prison, where Nelson Mandela labored for 27 years in South Africa and emerged with the ability to forgive, so that the evil regime of apartheid finally came to an end. And that indomitable spirit, embodied by Gary Horn, which is why I carry Mr. H with me, is in every single one of us. We all are gifted with an indomitable spirit. We need to nurture it. We need to let it grow. We need to understand that each day we are making a difference on the planet, and try to make the best difference that we can.
Just wait a minute. One of the jobs that I have, I'm the senior advisor to the summit of the Nobel Peace Laureates. Each year, all the Nobel Peace Laureates get together and think and issue a statement. Last year, we met in Bogota, Colombia, to help 25 Nobel Peace Laureates to help end a civil war. I'm the representative of that group at the United Nations. They have asked that every youth and every adult ask our political leaders 3 questions, something you can do. If you're too old to join Roots and Shoots, maybe we should have an old people's Roots and Shoots. I'm in.
We do.
I'm
we
in.
have an old people's home.
I'm in. I'm in. I'm in. All of us old people, let's join Roots and Shoots. They asked 3 questions. Ask every political leader, what are you doing to protect the climate? What are you doing to end poverty? And what are you doing to eliminate nuclear weapons? Those 3 issues, if they're not dealt with, we don't leave a future for our children. We don't really bring our values into action. So it's asking those questions. But when Jane pulled the Nelson Mandela icon, I remembered that one of the summits they had, they collect together and they issue a statement. And the statement they issued 3 years ago was, because they were honoring Mandela for something, and it's appropriate to end with this, they said, the greatest impediment to peace is the human mind without love and compassion. The greatest thing an individual can do is find love and bring it into action. And if there's any human being that we know has done that, out of all the humans, it is Dr. Jane Goodall. And for that, thank you. I love you, Jane.
Love you too.
I know.
Oh, that's wrong.
Too loud?
Everybody.